for those who don't know me, my name is Samuel Brown. I'm the head of Climate Risk Insights and Solutions. I'm from Celsius Pro. Celsius Pro has been working together with clients from the public and the private sector since 2008 on the topic of mitigating the adverse financial impacts of climate change. And I'm kind of welcoming you today to this webinar on the topic of global impacts of climate change on Switzerland's supply chains. We had a very rough year, globally speaking, with regards to extreme weather and climate events. I just want to mention two which were specifically very striking when it came to supply chain disruptions caused by weather, extreme weather or climate events, such as, or affecting on the one hand, healthcare sectors or affecting the productivity or revenue of companies. One being Hurricane Helene, that caused disruption in the healthcare system due to an impact in North Carolina that obstructed the distribution and production of IV fluids in the US, which basically affected the entire healthcare system in the US. And the more local issue in the canton of Valais, where a company called Novelis that produces aluminium for Porsche was affected by floods and could not supply these goods to Porsche, affecting also the sales of Porsche going forward. So it's really a relevant topic that going forward will become more frequent and more intense in the context of these extreme weather and climate events. And that's why we also want to drive forward this debate and action in the Swiss economy together with the public and the private sector. And with that said, I want to also just briefly also thank again to our amazing speakers that we have today, and also say a big thank you to the stakeholders that have already been joining us on the journey of this project that we will be talking about. And again, a warm welcome to the new stakeholders and interested parties that would like to learn more about what we're doing here. And with that said, I'll hand over to our moderator today, who is Samuel Eberenz from Stiftung Risiko-Dialog. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Samuel Brown. Also a very warm welcome from my side. I'm project lead at Risiko-Dialog in Zurich with a focus on climate and energy, with a background in climate risk modeling at ETH. And I will lead you through this lunch webinar today. And we're very excited to have speakers both from the NCCS Impacts program and the Federal Office for the Environment, but also from companies actually involved in supply chains that are the main focus point of our program. For those who don't know where they are here, this is a webinar coming out of the NCCS Impacts project. What NCCS is, Vincent Roth will tell us a bit more about in a minute, with the focus on the global impacts of climate change on Switzerland's supply chains. And in this, we've been working for almost 2 years now in the consortium of Celsius Pro, Risiko-Dialog, Corentex, EBP, and ETH Zurich, modeling the impacts at the moment and to come in different climate scenarios, but also talking to stakeholders and talking about this, how impacts of climate-related events on supply chains affect the economy of Switzerland and companies and business cases, but also the security of supplies, for example, when it comes to pharmaceuticals or food in Switzerland. About 1 year, almost exactly 1 year ago, we had the first workshop, and I'm happy to see some of you in the participants list who've joined this workshop, also with people from companies and the public sector, where we introduced the program and invited them to give us, or invited you to give us first feedback, but also inputs on your relationship to the topic and your needs. And what was quite striking there, that there's different pillars why this project that we'll learn more about in the next hour is interesting for stakeholders. And one is, of course, that companies want to know more about the supply chain risk in relation to climate change. But at this specific moment, this is amplified by two factors that what we found in the stakeholder engagement. One is, of course, that there is more voluntary and mandatory reporting and risk management requirements coming up, both for the public and the private sector. But also, there's a lot of people really feeling the urgency of climate change, climate risks, as citizens, as individuals, but also in their professional roles, and who really see a big advantage of or purpose of this project and the outcome that we are hoping to produce here in raising awareness within the organizations and with their clients and stakeholders around the topic of climate risk in the short and long term on supply chains for Switzerland. And with this, I really hope that today with this webinar, we can deepen this discussion. We will have updates from the project, and we will have an overview of the NCCS program as a whole. And then we will have two inputs from companies on their take on this topic and the climate-related supply chain risks. And with this, I'm very happy to introduce Vincent Roth from the Federal Office for the Environment. He is a climate scientist in background with a PhD in Geography and Sustainable Development from the University of Bern. And he's worked also in development and development cooperation, which is super interesting for our international link in Ethiopia, but also the Lao People's Democratic Republic. Had a brief intermezzo in research and development in engineering, and is now, so to say, back to roots and working for the federal government in climate adaptation and climate research. And we're very happy to have him as a sparring partner in the NCCS program.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Also, can you see my screen? Yes, I think so.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Vincent Roth. I'm based at the Federal Office for the Environment. I'm working in climate adaptation, and as such, I'm the project manager from the NCCS side for this project. I will give you a very short introduction to the NCCS and how this project is embedded in a wider context. So the NCCS stands for National Center for Climate Services and is the federal network for climate services in Switzerland. As you can see on the map, it consists of 7 federal offices, all based in Bern, except for Meteorschweiz, which is in Zurich, and 2 research institutions, the ETH Zurich and the Swiss Federal Institute for Forests, Snow and Landscape. The NCCS also partners up with different other institutes around Switzerland. It was constituted after a call from the Global Framework for Climate Services in 2015, which asked to establish national coordination mechanisms also for Switzerland, and it is organized in like a virtual center, which brings together administrative bodies, but also research institutions. Now, the vision and the goals of the NCCS are very simple. The vision is to provide climate services for resilient Switzerland, not only for today, but also for the future. And in order to realize this, there are 3 overarching goals, which you can see here. So the NCCS develops and disseminates climate services, something very important because many people are working on climate services, but oftentimes they are not, there's no coordination between different bodies, and the information is somewhere in the internet and not centralized. So this is one of the main goals, is to bundle the existing climate services in one place, which is the NCCS. The other main point is to promote the stakeholder dialogue as we do today, to bring people together with similar ideas, similar problems, and to promote exchange between them. And also, of course, to develop and communicate information, processes, and solutions. Also something that is done by NCCS. So the priority themes are quite wide. There's a very broad area of focus going from civil protection, forests, hail, crop, human health, animal health, and also the mostly known climate scenarios, CH 2018, which were developed by Meteo Schweiz for NCCS, the NCCS, and which are widely used in Switzerland. And at the same time, also the hydrological scenarios, which are also very widely used. Now, inside this general NCCS the priority themes, there's also the idea to have this program, which is called NCCS Impacts. And the NCCS Impacts are anchored in a resolution from the Federal Council from 2020, which asked to have a specific analysis of the effects of climate change on Switzerland. As you can imagine, in a global context, Switzerland is oftentimes too small to have specific be that climate scenarios or impact scenarios. And so until recently, there wasn't much on that topic. So the idea was to specifically define scenarios and also impacts for Switzerland. And this is what the NCCS impact is for. The idea is to give an overview of the effects of climate change on Switzerland, to define the key challenges for the environment, the economy, and society, and also to have to define out of it some basis for decision making, to have jointly produced climate services that can be used by a large audience and are specific for Switzerland. And of course, as a federal body, we have this authority-oriented support which we want to give, and which also comes from this NCCS Impacts program. So the program runs from 2023 to 2025. So we're halfway there. It is financed by all NCCS members, and it's currently coordinated by Meteo Schweiz and the NCCS Secretariat. You can find more information through the hyperlink which you see down below. The NCCS Impacts is the whole program is integrated into the wider subject of extremes and social justice. It's based on the climate scenarios, CH 2018, and it mainly focuses on 5 main topics and 2 further topics. So same as I said before, with Switzerland being very small, we don't have SSPs, this shared socioeconomic pathways for Switzerland. So one of the projects is developing those based on global and also on European SSPs specifically for Switzerland. We have the project which we will discuss today, the global impacts of climate change on Switzerland. Of course, we have the impacts on ecosystem services. We have the impacts on human and animal health, as this being one of the top risks in the future. And we also have something widely expected, the impact costs of climate change in Switzerland. And you have the other 2 projects, which are the impact of climate change on critical infrastructure, which is carried out outside of the NCCS Impacts project, but in collaboration. And you have the entire climate information, which is supplemented by Meteo Schweiz, and on which all the other projects are based. So today we are discussing this global impact of climate change on Switzerland. This is one of the 5 main projects. It is the project that will explore the insights into Switzerland's economic performance in the context of future weather and climate-related disruptions. And it will make the findings available to key economic sectors, to countries and economic areas and their climate-related vulnerability. So these are the main goals of this project, with the key questions being how does climate change affect the production chains to Switzerland? How does climate change affect the international sales market? What is the impact of, for example, rising sea levels? And what is the impact on basic food supply, medicine supply on a global scale? So today we are halfway there. The project is on track so far, and we are now aiming at putting the results into perspective and at producing communication projects. I will not go into more detail as Samuel is better suited to inform you on this, and he will certainly do this in the following presentation. So with this, I'm actually at the end of my presentation, and I don't know, Samuel, if you want to do the questions right now or if you keep it for the end.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vincent, for setting the scene for us. With this, before we go into the inputs, I want to give a short overview what exactly we're expecting today in the scene that Vincent has set. So if you have questions to Vincent on the NCCS and his role in it and the federal office's perspective, please feel free to put them in the chat. Unfortunately, Vincent will have to leave before the discussion at the end to head off for another meeting, so he can't join the discussion at the end. So what are we going to have? We will have Samuel Brown introducing the project. Then we'll have the inputs from 2 stakeholders who I will introduce separately. And then we will have time for discussion, questions, Q&A, and discussions at the end till 1:30 for those who can stay that long. And we're, of course, happy if many of you are willing and able to bear with us. So if you have questions or discussion points, you are also welcome to use the meeting group chat to drop them there. Please don't spam it, but we're happy to have your questions and we'll try to pick them up in the discussion at the end. But of course, there will also be the chance to just raise your hands in the end. But for the next 3 inputs, we will not have questions and discussions directly, but afterwards. And with that, Samuel has already pulled up his slide. Samuel Brown from Celsius Pro. He will introduce himself, or already kind of introduce himself in the very beginning, and I'm very happy to give him a heads up. And before that, I will just say that there's a recording of a presentation that we're doing, and we'll still have to do a quick check whether we can share all of that after that call, but we'll try to share as much as we can from the speaker's perspectives. And now to you, Samuel.
Thanks, Sam. So I did already introduce myself and my position. What I did forget to mention is that from an implementation perspective, I'm the project lead on the execution side of this project, so I'm happy to guide you through. I want to just make you aware that Vincent already mentioned the other companies that are involved, which I will also talk about in a second. But there behind me, there are many experts working on the modeling and various other knowledge that flows into this that have provided work over the last 2 years, and I want to thank them a lot for this. Just briefly about my input. So I will dive into first a few conceptual aspects to also onboard the new stakeholders. So it might be a repetition for existing stakeholders, but also a brief reminder. We will then dive into first results that we want to show you and talk about what one of the products that we're going to what will come out of this project, what it potentially could look like. I want to raise here as well that we have some Mentimeter questions ready, where we would really appreciate if you could give your input during the slide session. So if you want to get out your mobile phones already to get ready to answer those questions, that would be super helpful. I'll just kick off very briefly with some advertisement on our own behalf. So what our team does is basically provide services to the public and private sector on the entire value chain of climate risks. So we support our clients with the integration of climate risk, identification, scenario analysis, regulatory reporting, and risk transfer. I think most importantly, we want to drive a lot of change in the market, and for that, capacity building is a huge part of it, and that's being providing workshops and webinars like this. I want to emphasize that we have been and are looking to run workshops with companies in Switzerland to advocate and help companies understand climate risk and talk to different stakeholders in order to make this topic higher on the agenda internally. And one big part of that is also I'd like to advertise the Swiss Climate Reporting Forum, which is going into the 3rd edition on the 14th of May next year, which is a very good platform for the discussion of climate risk. And obviously climate risk with regards to supply chain is also a big topic there. So diving into the project, you might be asking yourself, okay, this is about impacts of global climate change to supply chains, but what exactly are we looking at and which questions do we answer? So in a nutshell, what we're doing, we are looking at the key sectors of the Swiss economy, which basically we found being the most relevant ones with regards to international trade of Switzerland. So what we're doing there is we're looking at the forestry, agriculture, mining, services, utilities, and manufacturing sector, abroad, outside of Switzerland, but also in Switzerland. So predominantly what we're looking at is how these different sectors and subsectors are shocked from upstream interruptions, but also from downstream interruptions. So if products actually leave Switzerland and then are sold elsewhere. We are looking also additionally to the sectors that you see here, and Vincent mentioned it before, we are specifically also looking at the pharmaceutical supply chains, food supply chains, and raw material supply chains as focus groups as well. We are looking at various different natural hazards, so these being droughts, river floods, sea level rise, tropical cyclones, European windstorms across the entire world. And we're looking at these from a perspective of today and in 2060. In different climate change scenario pathways, being the representative concentration pathway of the IPCC 2.6 and 8.5, where we compare the different scenarios. What does this actually mean concretely? And we'll go a bit into the modeling chain a bit later, but fundamentally, maybe from a company perspective, a lot of you might know that you have, or you know your immediate suppliers that are supplying the goods that you buy. You have their addresses from your procurement, etc. But what you don't know is your tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. And likewise, the same on the downstream supply chain. So what we're actually doing is we're looking at the exposure of these different sectors globally, and we use proxy data to show these and geospatially on a map. As you can see on the left side, there is an example for the global forestry exposure that we approximate based on underlying open source data. And we then shock this exposure with the natural hazards in the different scenarios and timelines. And then we monitor with the help of input-output tables how this impact then trickles down into Switzerland. And likewise, we do the same for the downstream, where we shock the downstream exposure and look how it trickles down backwards into Switzerland. So here the key message is really we're looking at upstream and at downstream supply chains, and we're using a mixed methodology, using modeling and also qualitative literature work to kind of assess these impacts onto the Swiss sectors. But one first question I would have to you is, and you see the QR code top right to log into the Menti as well as the code there. So we would be very interested to hear from you what you are more interested in. If you are more interested in the upstream impact on supply chains or the downstreams. And it might be that you're interested in both, which we are as well, but just to get an understanding from what comes first to your mind when you think about this topic, what is more relevant to you of the two. We will, at the end of the presentation, then wrap up the results together with Kaspar, who will show the results of the survey. But I will continue now after a quick break, letting you log into Menti and choosing the right answer or the appropriate answer. I'd like to, before we go further, then mention the key products of this project, because it's really important for you to understand what will be the outcome and what can you work with going forward after the project. So on the one hand, we will have a climate impact report, which you can assume is a PDF and a technical report, which underlines all the findings of the project, which will be also accessible through the NCCS webpage. One of the most important outputs of the project is an interactive map, which we will look at in a few minutes. On this map, we are basically providing this map to the public in order to interact with the map and derive information that would help them with regards to mitigating these climate impacts or build awareness internally within your companies or department of federal administration on this topic. And basically, this should act as a baseline for you to start building awareness as well. The third product is also that we are working with the Climada modeling chain, which is an open source model provided by the Weather and Climate Risk Group of the ETH Zurich, and we will feed all the creation of code, etc., back into that model chain, so that the public can access this model going forward as well. So maybe just a bit of a first technical input with regards to how this actually works. So it goes here from left to right, and as mentioned, it's a mixed method, but what we're focusing here is specifically the modeling value chain. So what we did as a first step is looking at the relevance assessment, understanding the trade relations Switzerland has and the exposures and the connections with different companies to select which are the most important sectors in Switzerland to focus on. As a next step, we use the open source Climada model to combine the hazard aspect with the different scenarios, the vulnerability aspect, and the exposure aspect of where these different sectors are located and how much they produce. The hazard being basically the various different metric or layer of data that gives you insights of how intense and how frequent natural hazards are across the world on different geospatial spaces. The vulnerability connects the two, basically describing how a various different sector will be impacted by a specific natural hazard and how this damage ratio looks like. By combining these three aspects, we calculate an impact onto an asset as a first step. We then translate this impact to an asset to a productivity loss on a sectoral level. So we actually then calculate the productivity loss abroad in the different sectors outside of Switzerland. We then use input-output tables to understand how those sectors globally are connected with each other, but also with Swiss sectors. And then we trickle down these impacts into Switzerland to get a clear understanding how the sector here will be indirectly impacted from a productivity loss perspective. In order to make this more digestible, we then take these impacts, which are quantified, and create an economic impact index that basically describes it from a value 1 to 10 how big this impact will be on the key sectors of the Swiss economy. So before we dive into this, I would like to mention, so these are preliminary or intermediary output results of the model, and these are still subject to change with regards to the final outcome of the project. But we have actually managed to kind of go through this entire value chain of the model and produce results, and would like to present them you now. So on the one hand, I would like to show you what this, or the key objective of this slide is also that you understand how these hazards look like, or these outputs of the project look like, and so that you can get some reasonable awareness of what the outcome also of the project could look like and whether they are useful to you or not. So on the left side, you see in an index from 0 to 10, which is the economic impact, to all of the sectors in Switzerland across all the hazards today. So you have basically where you see red is the value of 10. You have a high impact economically, for example, from the US or Russia on the Swiss sectors jointly today. You have others where it's light blue or white, where basically the impact to the Swiss economy here is not that large. And that is based on how much actually the hazard, so how much the natural catastrophe can affect those, but also how big the trading relationship is between the two companies, between the two countries, I'm sorry. On the right side, you see a graph where we display the change from today to the future across all hazards. So you see that in some countries, which are labeled purple here, the impact going forward to 2060 in a worst case scenario as RCP 8.5 can increase more than 150% across all sectors. And this kind of output is upstream, what you can see here, but can also be created with regards to the demand or the downstream impacts of the Swiss sectors. And below, you see here, both of these graphs are across all hazards and across all sectors. We can actually, or will produce impacts like this across different sectors and for different hazards individually as well. So that will also enable users to be able to answer the question as what is the expected risk to the Swiss economy from flood globally? But it will also be able to kind of nail down what is the impact on specifically the Swiss pharma sector from tropical cyclones in China today and in the future, for example. I think I need to speed up a bit, so I'll just nudge very briefly on this slide here. So here we also want to show you that we are producing specific quantified values, for example, million US dollars. And what you see here is the average annual production loss of different Swiss subsectors due to all the physical impacts in China. So really focusing on one country. And you see here, for example, these are the top 10 of the affected sectors. And you see that based on the first results, for example, you see that the pharmaceutical sector and the computer, electronic and optical product sector in Switzerland will be impacted most through the trading relationship with China and what will happen there with regards to physical impacts. So I mentioned before that one of the key products of the project is the interactive map, which will be uploaded, and I can show you this very briefly. This here is the NCCS website and the interactive map. This product will be placed on this website here. And basically, in order to interact when we release this product, in order to interact with it, you will have to go to this website, and then it will be open source for everybody to use. We are now at the stage of where we are in the design phase of what this map could look like. And what you see here is a first draft of, or a suggestion of what this map could look like. And it also kind of shows what the user journey of this map will be. So I'll start at the top, being that there are two focus areas, top left and top or right, which are the upstream supply chains and downstream supply chains, which we're looking at separately. There will be different filters, today, future, different sectors you can select, the natural hazard if you want to select, and then you might also be able to look at average per year or extreme events. The map will be an interactive part, which will then indicate various different impacts. But also when clicking on various different countries, the map will be able to give various different more detailed insights of the trade relationship and how it will be impacted. So we also envision that we will have further content such as key messages and recommendations also embedded, but we're still working on understanding what the best level is here and how this should be shown. So with regards to this, I would like to just ask you again to go on to the Mentimeter, and it would be really appreciated if you could help us by answering the following questions, whether, again, what is more relevant to you? Is it really the indirect impact to your sector that you're interested in, or are you more interested in where the impact is coming from internationally? The second question being, if you continue clicking to the next page, will be which statements or values would help you to take measures? Is it more a quantitative risk index between 1 and 10? Is it more a qualitative risk index, high, medium, or low? Or is it a relative monetary value for each sector in percentages? Or is it an absolute monetary value for each sector? So I'll give people a second to fill this in. And while you do that, because I'm at the end of my presentation, I just briefly want to summarize again. So we are working together with our partners from the NCCS, of course, but with Corentix, Stiftung Risiko-Dialog and Corentix on this project to assess both upstream and downstream supply chains. We're using a mixed model approach, but with an emphasis on using the Climada open source model, where we actually try to quantify the impacts upstream and downstream through open source data and exposures to the different sectors in Switzerland. And we want to showcase this on a platform of the NCCS at the end of the project. Should you be interested in getting more involved, don't hesitate to get in touch with us to discuss further with us, myself and Kaspar, but also with Samuel Eberenz from Stiftung Risiko-Dialog. We're really open to exchange on ideas and outputs, how to drive this topic further. With that said, Kaspar, can I ask you to maybe share the results of the Mentimeter?
Yes. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So thanks to everyone for the replies. Very interesting. I just, because of time constraints, I just briefly go through. We're happy to share the results also afterwards with you. And of course, you can look at the recording. So I have a very clear tendency here of what is of most interest to you. It's clearly really your suppliers, much more than sales markets effects on your companies, assuming most of you will be private sector. Less clear on this question, what is more relevant. That makes a lot of sense. It was a tough question, and obviously both of these questions are very important to answer for you. And as Sammy hinted at, we definitely aim to provide a product that is able to answer kind of, or that kind of represents both perspectives. And then on the risk measure, so to speak. Again, quite uneven responses. This will be a challenge definitely for the project team, trying to accommodate these various perspectives. Very, very valuable results for us. For now, I saw that some of you already replied the further questions in the question set, which Sammy did not mention. I want to ask you to please do this. Could also be after the webinar. And it's worth mentioning that this is not just out of curiosity, it really might flow into design decisions in the final product. So if you have not done it yet, please try to reply to these questions. And speaking of this, we would like to ask those of you who will be willing to provide some more insight, maybe based on the answer you give, whether you could email us or just use the chat to drop your names so that we know that we could approach you later to get a bit more understanding of your needs that could be considered in the further development of the project's product. With this, I hand over back to you, Samuel Eberenz, I assume.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Caspar and Samuel. I assume you will also put the contact email address in the chat still, so people can easily send you their inputs or reach out to collaborate on data or specific follow-ups for the questions asked in the meeting. And after this overview of what we're doing in this project and where we stand, we're very happy to really get to applied perspectives on the topics and inputs. And I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker, Alissa Monk. She's currently working as a sustainability, or as they say, fair sustainability co-officer at 1023 Health. Before that, she was previously an environmental sustainability lead in the research departments at Novartis, and she's very active in different groups and consortia, executive member of Go Circular in Life Sciences, active in the My Green Lab, doing all of this with her background really deep in the topic of environmental science and also specifically ecotoxicology. So from this, we know already she's very active, not only in her key role, but really bringing actors together as we do to address systemic issues. And she's very passionate about understanding and measuring environmental impact and creating tools and automated processes to help accelerate sustainable action, as she told us before the call. So, Alissa, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, and thanks for having me here today. So I will give a bit of a view into the pharmaceutical industry and the impact of climate change on pharma supply chains, and then a little bit of insight into us as a company and our approach of how we're kind of mitigating these risks. So next slide. I don't think I need to kind of explain how important the pharmaceutical industry is to the Swiss economy, and also for the supply of medicines for the healthcare system within Switzerland as well. And the supply chains of the pharmaceutical industry are particularly vulnerable to the effects, both sourcing of materials, so the upstream risks, there are huge supply risks as we saw from some of those prelim results. So from raw materials or even those completed products that we're using for the manufacture of medicines. And then what this could lead to as an example of COVID, kind of to buffer or mitigate this risk. You get a whole lot of bulk buying of products that particularly usually have a shelf life. And so you kind of got in this catch-22 situation where, okay, do we kind of buffer our risks and ensure that we can supply the medicines, or how do we kind of then mitigate our overall footprint and impact that comes from kind of some of the overproduction or waste that can come from this oversupply? Of course, oh, sorry, back. Of course, then we also have the risk that our own operations can be impacted. As Samuel mentioned, there were floods in Visp. We are operational in Visp. Luckily, we missed it this time, but who knows? And then, of course, downstream for the pharmaceutical industry, it's around distribution delays, and particularly for like our specialization, which is biological medicines. They need particular conditions, and there are impacts that can high temperatures that can impact product integrity, for example, and overall climate impact on public health, and can we actually meet those demands for the medicines that will be needed in certain situations as well. Thank you. Next slide. And so some challenges kind of come up from this in kind of how can we actually assess what our risk is with all of this. We kind of understand where the risks are, but the actual magnitude of risk really difficult for us to understand. And so for a given product, this downstream data is extremely scarce. Whether this is the raw material source location, as Samuel mentioned, those kind of further tiers, it gets harder to get that information. But even the manufacturing location of a set product, this is difficult for us to get from suppliers. Then we don't really have the information or a lot of information. So this is why it's super valuable to have projects like this one presented today, that these downstream risk models are limited. It's difficult for us to know how we should try to prepare for the risks. So it's really difficult for us to calculate our company risk, reliable, accurate risk to us as a company based on the supplies that we're using, or potentially where the medicines will be distributed. On top of this, there is this kind of expectation to report on these risks, and this is coming from the risk disclosures, both the nature-related and the climate-related task force. It's reliant on kind of this more granular data that is quite sparse. So how do we kind of approach this, knowing the challenges kind of that we have? First thing first is kind of doing our part and minimizing our impact. If you could go to the next slide. So just to give a little bit of insight into who we are, we're 1023. We're a fairly new player in the CDMO space, contract manufacturing and development space. In the pharmaceutical industry, with a focus on biologic sterile medicines, injectable medicines. As a company, Fairstainability was present at inception. And so we kind of really have this purpose and value to Fairstainability. A fairly new company, as we said, only 3 years old. With about 200 employees on sites in Basel and in Visp. Next slide, please. And yeah, as I mentioned, sustainability is at the core of what we do as a company. We're recently certified B Corporation, which is really kind of moving towards this more collective action for an equitable and regenerative economy. That's making sure that you're including other values as part of that. Next slide. Overall approach to sustainability, as most companies, is the measure, reduce, offset, and that measure part becomes super important. here, right? How can we then kind of reduce our impact and kind of include all of the granular data that's needed? As I mentioned, it really is embedded in what we do as a company. We've identified those quick wins, low-hanging fruits, and kind of have this idea of continuous improvement. We don't then kind of look for that kind of final perfect solution, but really incrementally build the solutions that are needed. So we're always really action focused. And a big part of what we do is collaborating and sharing our knowledge, sharing any information to projects such as these, knowing that it's kind of helping everyone. It's kind of really our part as being part of the greater whole. Just a little bit on our climate targets and our kind of current results. Our main target is that by the end of next year, we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% on Scope 1 and 2 and commit to being part of the Science-Based Initiative. I'm super proud to say we're already now part of the Science-Based Initiative, and we got our targets approved. And we're very close to reaching that 50% already this year. Hopefully, we're around 49% reduction. And this then kind of comes from our commitment to renewable energy, which we've used then from inception, and then knowing that there are some unavoidable emissions, we kind of offset those emissions and also offset what we kind of class as operational Scope 3, business travel, waste. There are a few different categories there that we offset. Next slide, please. So that was a little bit into how we kind of reduce our kind of impact on the system and hopefully kind of do our part to lower the impacts of climate change. And one thing that then we try to do is kind of purchasing local when possible, right, to mitigate some of these effects. But I think, you know, as is evident, as we've seen not only this year and in previous years, now flooding in Germany, even close to home here in Switzerland. So this isn't always going to be a safeguard, and so we do need other strategies. Next point. And one approach that we've kind of taken is kind of like trying to find that focus or the prioritization of the suppliers or those certain products that we really need to kind of have a better mitigation strategy. And this is kind of criticality to the business versus how many alternatives potentially are there on the market and where are those alternatives coming from. And so this is where understanding global kind of impacts can help us kind of plan and make our supply chains resilient. One way that we're kind of doing that is with a partnership with a company called Elio. With them, we've co-designed software using AI and big data approach. What we're able to do there is get immediate sustainability impact data on a given product and also the companies. And then it also suggests all the alternatives. So we're able to kind of lower our impact here. And with them also, we are starting to kind of look at how we can get access now to this manufacturing data through publicly available data. So there is some movement there, which is super, super valuable, I think, not only to us, but even to projects, such as the one discussed today. Next development stages here allow that scenario modeling, something that isn't done often in business. I don't think often enough in business is to really do that scenario modeling. And so I think the tool allowing those scenario models can be super powerful. And on the collaboration piece, knowing the challenges that we're facing in kind of being able to access data from suppliers with Elio and also Cytiva, a huge supplier to the pharmaceutical industry, we co-founded a Pharma Eco-Design Consortium with a first working project here that is building this data sharing framework that is kind of, one, limiting the amount of admin a company then has to do to try and gain access to some of the data, but also creating some of the pressure that is needed so that we can have access to this data and be able to reliably or accurately calculate the risks. And with that, I hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alissa Monk, for these brilliant insights. And please think everyone already about your questions and comments and potential collaborations for Alissa. And also feel free to use the chat already. And without further delay, before we head into discussion, I am really pleased now to introduce Oskar Jönsson. He studied environmental science at ETH Zurich and is now working as a business development manager for Gebana AG. After sustainability with Alissa, we have now a Gebana, which would speak to gerechte Banana, fair bananas. He'll tell us more about this company. And among other things, he's now responsible for selling organic cacao, cashew, and dried mango from Togo and Burkina Faso to business clients. So the floor is yours, Oskar. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks a lot also for inviting me. Happy to share a little bit on what we are doing. It will mainly focus on the upstream part, of course, while downstream will also be interesting to talk about. But I'll just briefly introduce what we do, and then I'll touch a little bit upon how we are impacted and what we are doing to trying to manage this. So you can move ahead to the next slide, Sammy. So I mean, you already introduced me, but I put here some pictures. So my background is in environmental science, studied also with Sammy, and then moved to sustainable trade policy on paper, let's say. So also federal administration, and now I'm doing sustainable trade policy in practice. So really sourcing from West Africa, the cocoa beans, cashew, and also the dried mango, and then selling it to clients here in Europe and the US mainly. So if we go to the next slide, there's a world map where we source mainly from. So these two locations in Burkina Faso and Togo, they were already mentioned. But then we also source, for instance, Brazil nuts from Brazil, dates from Tunisia. We also have almonds from Pakistan, and the list is very long. So basically we source from all over the world, mainly in the global south, and then sell it in the global north. Also to you guys, if you want, you can check out the gebana.com homepage. There's the shop, and you can order whatever you like. We are really committed to sustainability, not just in terms of environmental sustainability where we source, but one of our strengths is really that we also pay high prices to farmers. So basically the prices they should have, and also pay out additional premiums, which is then shown here on the right side. Basically 1.6 million. I think now it's close to 2 million per year. So this is really a big share also of the Swiss fair trade premiums that are paid out each year. I think it's about 10% or so, even though we're not 10% of the market. So if we go to the next slide, just for you to see a little bit what it looks like in Togo, we are exporting around 600 tons of cocoa beans annually. That's from around 2,000 smallholders. And this then ends up in chocolate sold in France, sold in Switzerland, sold in the United States, and also on our own shop, for instance. So tropical environment, very, very nice, nice and warm, and also quite humid, which isn't the case in Burkina Faso necessarily. If you go to the next slide, with subtropical climate that is ideal for growing cashew nuts and mango, where we do about each 1,000 tons per year, and also have an operations in Burkina Faso with about 800 employees that are processing the cashew nuts to what you then can buy in the store. And obviously, we are impacted, if you go to the next slide, Sami, by climate change. On the left-hand side, I just put the change in normal rainfall, for instance. That's just one example. It's from July 24, so it's not linked to the graph on the right-hand side, but it's something we've been seeing over the past years, that temperatures and rainfall are not necessarily following like established patterns or historical patterns, which also makes for more difficult harvests. And so here on the right-hand side, you see the price of the raw cashew nut on the farm gate level in Senegal. It was more or less similar in Burkina Faso, so really a quite steep rise because of heat extremes during flowering. So there was about, I think, 10 or 20% reduction in the crop, and also a reduction in the quality, which meant that prices were really going up. And if you go to the next slide, the interesting part is that we have all our farmers registered in a tool, which is called Crop-In. So we have full traceability back to every farmer, and we know what their plot is. We register every purchase. We also have the yield, of course, and per year. And the interesting thing is that it's not necessarily going down. So while the region as overall has a problem, and there's like a drop in yields, we're not necessarily seeing that we have less material to sell. And the reason for this is that we never are able to capture like 100% of what our farmer produces, so the people we work with, because even if there is a contract, there is side selling. So it's all basically price dependent. If we are able to just pay more, we'll just get the amount we want. And that basically is then really dependent on our ability to pass on the higher price to the consumer or the client in Europe in the end. So I think that's a little bit an interesting catch, that you would expect that we have a problem with sourcing, in terms of absolute volumes, which is not necessarily the case. But somebody will, of course, have this problem at some point. But given if you're able to basically just raise your price, you can avoid this. But for that, you need people who are willing to pay this in the end. So if we go to the next slide, I just put basically, let's say our flagship project for adaptation. We're working on a lot of mitigation projects as well, so to make our operations more sustainable in terms of limiting the emission of carbon. But in terms of adaptation, our best bet is really to invest in resilient agriculture. And one of the bigger projects we have is doing dynamic agroforestry. So really supporting the smallholder farmers to diversify their farms and make sure that it's really they have a good cover of the ground, that it's not just like monocultures, and that they also have other crops that they grow together with the cash crops to make sure that, for one, the soil is healthy, but also to be able to retain more water and to get more resilient when there's drought or heat extremes. And we do see improved yields for these plots. It's not quite clear if it's really due to better soil fertility or better water retention, or if it's just also because these farmers are putting more attention to their plots in general. So obviously also supporting pruning and so on. So it's not quite clear where it comes from, but people are really happy, and especially in Burkina Faso, it's really taking off, and a lot of people or a lot of the smallholders, they want to be working with this and install these plots on their premises. And so, I think that's more or less it. Obviously, you can also support us in our efforts if you just buy from us. And so happy to answer any question you might have in this regard.
Thank you very much, Oskar Jönsson. And this time your slide was correct, and like before from Vesa, now it's actually time for questions and discussions. We had 4 inputs. We had a short introduction by Vesa, then we had Samuel Brown from Celsius Pro introducing our project, and Alissa Monk and Oskar Jönsson from 1023 Health and Gebana sharing insights from the work on the ground when it comes to supply chain risks and also fairness in supply chain, so to say. Thank you again for these very interesting inputs. And I'm checking the participants list for any raised hands. Until then, I think we had a question in the chat to Alissa regarding the supply chain visibility. Is the strategy focused on both reducing Scope 3 emissions and increasing resilience when it comes to supply chain visibility?
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of as I mentioned earlier, this is really where this becomes some of these catch-22 scenario of how do you ensure that resiliency, which, you know, the common strategy here is around bulk buying to ensure you have the access to the supply, and still make sure that you can reduce Scope 3 emissions. And yeah, for us, strategy is not just then for us as a company, it's really to kind of push the transparency that is needed for the access to the data for companies to be able to do this, but also pushing for kind of co-responsibility models that are needed, right? We own those Scope 3 emissions with our suppliers, all the rest of the tiers, we co-own that, right? So we shouldn't just be pointing fingers. They don't produce the products if we don't need them. And so it's kind of quite a large strategy around our Scope 3 or our whole value chain emission. We don't just focus on carbon. And absolutely visibility for us as a company, but also for industry and kind of the greater good and you know, bigger picture information.
I think I would like to pick up on the co-responsibility part. I think Oskar showed us a very nice example of how they react to the impacts they see with the suppliers and their partners, increasing the resilience. In other sectors, there might be fear that instead of helping the partners and suppliers to get more resilience, companies might just switch, if that's so simple, to countries that are less exposed, which of course would be a negative impact when it comes to climate justice and co-responsibility. What are developments that you see in the pharmaceutical sector?
Yeah, look, I think it's slow. Pharma is traditionally very competitive, and so kind of pushing for some of this collaboration is harder. I would say there is more the pressure cascading a little bit from the Science-Based Target Initiative, trying to get people to kind of sign up to that, but not really thinking necessarily about this co-ownership or kind of shared responsibility models yet. For us, it would be kind of really thinking about creating the case for that as well, a little bit like Gebana does here, right? I mean, here you can kind of be the poster child for still being a profitable company while doing the right thing. So I think the pharma industry, it is moving, right? Part of the associations that we're part of is kind of showing that companies are becoming more open to kind of collaborating. But I would say it too slow at the moment. So how do we kind of drive some of the pressure? And that's a little bit a part of our project with the Eco Design Consortium as well, right? Creating the right frameworks and the access models to data, but kind of then a little bit like science-based target, pushing a bit of the peer pressure that's needed as well.
Thanks. Are there any other questions from the audience? If so, please raise your hands. Then I will allow you to switch on your video. Until then, I've got another question, so please raise your hands if you want to jump in. Otherwise, I will jump in, maybe approaching Samuel Brown now from our project's perspective. What we've had also in discussions at our first workshop with stakeholders, and came back to my mind now when we saw two presentations, really how specific some of the impacts and climate patterns, etc., are. Like we have this global tool that we're building with global proxies for exposure, vulnerability, hazard. How close can we get to the reality of that Oskar is dealing with on the ground, or where can we, maybe from this high aggregated level, give support to Oskar's work? Wait, you're not still muted.
So thanks a lot for the question. I hope you can hear me now. Yeah, I think it's a very, very relevant point that we've also been discussing a lot in the project, because we are fundamentally flying on a sector and subsector productivity level, and we actually are not yet breaching the levels of on a product level. So kind of following the product value chain rather than the productivity chain. I think that's one of the limitations we currently have with the model, but we'll look at further closing in the future. But we think that even if these outputs will be on a higher level, they will still be able to give indications of dynamics within the market that also can be kind of give some insights on a product level. It might not reach the ground level information that Oskar can provide, but it definitely can kind of give an indication of the direction it is heading on the one hand. I think on the other hand, it is also, I just want to emphasize that also with regards to the tool that we are producing. I think it's also for sustainability or procurement functions, it's a starting point to use this tool, which also has the stamp of the Swiss government, to raise awareness internally, to drive forward the discussion, and to also use it as a basis for collaboration and the basis for discussion, to discuss collaboration amongst partners, to kind of initiate further deep diving onto a product level themselves as well. And I think that's one of the big objectives of this project, is to also kind of really start the debate on this topic and drive it forward.
Thanks, Samuel. We've got a question in chat from Eva Müller to both Alissa and Oskar. And this is an interesting one. Do you feel like increased legal and regulatory requirements are helping your cause, I guess, or rather counterproductive? I will start with Alissa.
I would say a bit of both. Some of the new regulations, the EU regulations that have come through, I mean, they're coming quite thick and fast, and in particular around the pharmaceutical industry as well, that definitely impact the pharmaceutical industry. It has driven mainly probably some of the larger companies to react more and become more ambitious with some of their targets. What is a bit counterproductive is some of the regulations and expectations around reporting and the multiple different frameworks to report under. It just is taking far too much time, which takes a lot of time now away from action. So I would say it's kind of trying to balance that. And as a company, one way, again, we kind of think of how we mitigate. Some of that is to try to move to digitalization and automation as much as possible. So I'll pass on to Oskar.
Yeah, I would second that. It's really like both. I think we are very well prepared for things like the EUDR or the Corporate Sustainability Directive, and like basically we're looking forward to having this implemented because we think we will perform well and others won't. So it will help us in this, giving us a competitive advantage. basically something we've always needed to sell to people that were doing this. And now if it becomes a norm, it will obviously become like a more clear competitive advantage. At the same time, there's also like a new organic regulation in the EU, which is just making it harder to import organic products, which is to some extent also like a legitimate concern because it's about organic integrity, but also just very difficult to implement in countries like Togo and Burkina Faso, where maybe it's not very clear what the farm size is, or what, if the chickens that they also have, should they also be organic or not. It's just not very practicable and not comparable to like a European farm setup.
Maybe coming back to Samuel with that before we come to a more technical question that's in the chat. The model or tool that we're producing in this project, or maybe more operational tools coming out of this prototype, can they contribute to companies now newly tasked with reporting on their global climate risks? And if so, to what extent?
Sorry, I acoustically, could you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yes, like regarding the regulatory requirements or reporting requirements, what contribution can the tool or maybe tools building on our prototype make there for companies who have these regulations and reporting issues?
Yeah, I think it's super relevant. So, I mean, with regards to the reporting requirements, I mean, there's a big movement also to disclose on the most material risks, and specifically when talking to a lot of companies in the Swiss market. When it comes to the materiality, a lot of companies are here, acting like a turntable. So they take products from abroad and then sell them abroad as well. So they're actually consuming a lot also from vulnerable countries across the world. And so when it comes from a materiality perspective, oftentimes the real materiality is in the supply chain. Upstream, which was also kind of shown in the Mentimeter that we did, that a lot of companies seem to be interested into the upstream supply chain. And therefore this tool can give an initial starting point to start looking at these risks in order to kind of further deep dive and disclose on this topic as well. So specifically meaning when it comes to disclosing the most material risks, and whether these are in the supply chain, you can clearly also embed this into internal processes, etc., and then communicate this also externally. And with this said, I particularly also mean this as a first interactive map will be a starting point, but I'm sure that from here it will go further and also be elaborated in more detail with more useful information that is hopefully more company specific. But that is at the current point still for the future, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Samuel. Before we come to the method question in the chat, I want to use this opportunity to already thank everyone for joining and thank again our speakers, also Versa, who's not in the call anymore, and have a short advertisement for the opportunity to, of course, talk to Samuel, Kasper, and me, also other members of the consortium, and also join our stakeholder event where we'll tell you more about the output and final results at the end of the project or towards the end of the project next year. If you want to be invited to and to stay informed, please drop an email to Kasper or me. I will also put my email address in the chat. And with that, let's spend the last few minutes of the webinar for those interested in the nitty-gritty parts with the question to Samuel. Could you please elaborate a bit more on the mixed method and modeling? Question is, how is the accuracy of the relevance assessment validated? How is the Climate model used? What are the challenges of this modeling approach? Of course, you can't answer everything to detail, but could you tell us a bit more on the methodology?
I can start with an input, and I'm happy for Kasper and maybe Michael to jump in as well. So I mean, fundamentally, it's a mixed method approach because from a modeling perspective, the open source model that we use really relies on also the input data. So rubbish in, rubbish out is the topic there. And we, because it is an open source model and we are relying on open source data, we are kind of crafting as good as possible and leveraging the data that is out there to put into the model to also create fundamentally robust results. So we've put in a ton of work in making these input data robust. But one of the challenges and limitations out there is even if you pour in a ton of work, there is not a lot of data out there that we can use. And for that reason, what we're trying to do is calibrate the model as good as we can with the available data, and to also address the uncertainty that goes with it as well. So that is kind of on the model approach, and the challenges are definitely the limitations with regards to data availability out there. Anything more to add, Kaspar?
Yeah, maybe a few things more concretely to the question as well concerning the relevance assessment. So if you're interested in some more of the technical details there, I think it's better to follow up. The bulk of the relevance assessment was performed by our partners, EBP. Generally, it was done through a rigorous analysis of Swiss trade relationships based on, to my understanding, established economic methods or approaches to do this. Of course, there are always different ways you can define the relevance. In this case, the basis was input-output tables, so really based on the flow of goods and services between Swiss sectors and sectors abroad. Now, how is, and maybe a second comment about the mixed method. So this also addresses the importance that due to several challenges with of course uncertainty in the modeling part, a qualitative discussion of existing literature concerning climate change impacts abroad and impacts and how these impact Switzerland is probably as important in the end as the model outputs, and we will put a lot of effort in contextualizing the quantitative results through a qualitative discussion as well, to make sure that the interpretation of the results is kind of supported also by us and not just dumping a bunch of model results without context and support for what they mean, etc. How is Climada, the Climada model used? So basically in the modeling part, it's really at the heart of it, both for direct impact calculation modeling and then also for the propagation of the direct impacts through input-output analysis, which is also implemented within Climada through its own module. So on a general level, that's at the challenges. I think someone has addressed already. The biggest challenge is basically that there are uncertainties at every point in the modeling chain. This is a modeling challenge for one, but you can always only reduce uncertainty so far. And then on the second hand, is especially a communication challenge. As I referred to, that's where the second part comes in of embedding the results, the quantitative results into a more general discussion.
Thank you, Kaspar, for elaborating. The participants number has not dropped as dramatically as I feared over the technical discussion, so there seems to be interest. That's good. Also, the quick note in the chat, I've put my email address, Kaspar has put his email address, and I've also put the URLs of the consortium members and the NCCS project. There's also the link to the information page about the Climada model by the ETH Weather and Climate Risk Research Group. So check this out. Save the chat if you're interested in these links, or click them now. And I think I don't see any more questions at the moment. So great, thanks for everyone bearing with us. Thanks to Oskar, Alissa, Samuel, and Vincent, and also Kaspar for the inputs. And please get in touch if you're not in touch already. And with this, enjoy maybe a few minutes of break before the next of your afternoon appointments.